Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Bowie's Bookshelf, The 100 Books That Changed David Bowie's Life, by John O'Connell, narrated by Simon Vance. Introduction. In July 1975, stick thin and in the grip of a severe cocaine addiction, David Bowie arrived in New Mexico to shoot The Man Who Fell to Earth. He was 28 and had been cast in the lead role of alien emissary Thomas Jerome Newton after the film's director Nicholas Roeg saw him in a BBC documentary called Cracked Actor and was struck by his air of ethereal otherness. On set, Bowie surprised everyone by being diligent and engaged, happy to banter with the crew and work on his lines with co-star Candy Clark. He had, rather ambitiously, promised not to use drugs for the duration of the shoot, so when he wasn't needed he would take himself off to his trailer and indulge in an altogether less harmful pastime, reading books. Luckily, he had plenty to choose from. As a Sunday Times location report explained, Bowie hates aircraft, so he mostly travels across the states by train, carrying his mobile bibliothèque in special trunks, which open out with all his books neatly displayed on shelves. In New Mexico, the volumes dealt mainly with the occult, his current enthusiasm. This portable library stored 1,500 titles, enough to make Clark's later observation to a journalist that Bowie really read a lot while making The Man Who Fell to Earth seem like a bit of an understatement. Fast forward to March 2013. The Victoria and Albert Museum's exhibition David Bowie Is has opened in London to rave reviews and record-breaking ticket sales. A career retrospective featuring some 500 items from the singer's personal archive, including costumes, paintings, handwritten lyrics and video storyboards, it will traverse the world before bowing out at New York's Brooklyn Museum just over 5 years later. To coincide with the opening in Ontario, the show's first port of call after London, the V&A issued the list, on which this book is based, of the 100 books Bowie considered the most important and influential, not, note, his favourite books as such, out of the thousands he had read during his life. These books had actually been a feature of the original London show, where a selection of them was suspended from the ceiling. Still, the list quickly went viral amid a flurry of incredulous commentary, much of it reducible to, "Wow, who knew David Bowie read so much?" Which was odd, because Bowie had advertised his bookishness for years, not just in interviews but more obliquely in his work, and the range of masks he wore when he presented it to the public. The mobile library story shows how Bowie's reading had calcified into a compulsion by the time he achieved his goal of being world famous. He went about it the way he went about everything, with a kind of manic fervour. As a casual habit, however, it would have started in his bedroom at 4 Plaistow Grove, the small terraced house in the London suburb of Bromley, where he spent his formative years of childhood and adolescence. Books were cool and sexy back then, even cooler and sexier than they are now. Imagine. Alan Lane didn't invent the paperback when in 1935 he launched Penguin Books, but he used his marketing and entrepreneurial genius to democratize reading, making the world's best writing available for the price of a packet of cigarettes. Bowie's post-war generation was the first to take this phenomenon for granted, so that by 1966, when the Beatles' Paperback Writer hit #1, the term stood somehow for the takeover of Britain's creative industries by people from provincial or working-class backgrounds. Bowie underperformed at school and left in 1963 with just one qualification to his name, a basic O-level in art. Given the wide range of interests he subsequently cultivated, this suggests not laziness or an inability to retain information so much as impatience with formal education. Like many autodidacts, Bowie realized early on that he enjoyed teaching himself much more than he enjoyed being taught, and he took huge pleasure in passing on what he had learned to others. When he loved a book, friends say, he would proselytize passionately on its behalf. This may be why, in 1998, he started writing book reviews for the US bookstore chain Barnes & Noble. They saw that I did a lot of book reviews on the site, his early website, BowieNet, and they figured that it might not be a bad thing if they got me to do some for them as well, he told Time Out. I gave them 5 categories I'd be interested in reviewing, from art to fiction to music. The first one I've done is Glam by Barney Hoskins. What's it like? Excellent. Bowie's creative method was particular and, until his imitators caught up with him, unusual for a pop musician. It involved opening himself wide to every possible influence, not just other music, but, and this is what marked him out, anything in any medium that might serve his vision. The resulting song, look, video, or album cover inevitably pointed the way home to its sources, but via multiple, circuitous routes, those sources having been distilled in the alembic of Bowie's charisma until they were sometimes barely recognizable. Bowie liked reading, so there was a natural role for books in this process. Bowie also liked playing games, and the V&A list is but one element of a game he enjoyed more than any other, that of curating his own mythology. It has a notable precedent, as Bowie surely knew. In 1985, a publisher asked the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, laureate of Libraries and Labyrinths, to choose his 100 favourite books and write an introduction to each. Borges only made it to number 74 before he died, but his list, like Bowie's, is wonderfully eclectic, suggestive and surprising, not to mention stuffed with writers we know or can be pretty certain that Bowie admired: Oscar Wilde, Franz Kafka, Thomas de Quincey. Though, oddly, there isn't a single title in common. I like to think Bowie intended his list as a homage to Borges, as a garden of forking paths, to borrow the title of one of Borges's most famous stories, where, if you turn left at Edward Bulwer-Lytton's Rosicrucian romance Zanoni, you end up at Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus, and where, having been inspired to seek clues to the identity of the real David Bowie by Flaubert's parrot, you're briskly funneled along to Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder, a book about the hair-splittingly fine line between artifice and authenticity. None of which is to accuse Bowie's list of being insincere or unrevealing. On the contrary, stare at it long enough, and 2 main patterns emerge. The first is made up of the different cultural elements that cohered to form Bowie's artistic sensibility. The second, a little hazier, has to do with chronology. Arranged in the right order, the books plot a course through Bowie's life from child to teenager, and from drug-addled superstar to reflective, reclusive family man. I never became who I should have been until maybe 12 or 15 years ago, he told the talk show host Michael Parkinson in 2002. I spent an awful lot of my life actually looking for myself, understanding what I existed for and what made me happy in life, and who exactly I was, and what were the parts of myself that I was trying to hide from. The role that reading played in this quest can't be underestimated, because reading is, among much else, an escape into other people, other perspectives, other consciousnesses. It takes you out of yourself only to put you back there, infinitely enriched. David Jones was born in Brixton, South London, on January the 8th, 1947. It's no surprise, then, if the books he found most significant are products of, or became fashionable in, the 1960s and 70s. Like everything else about us, our adult cultural habits are shaped by our childhoods, not just how or where we were brought up, but the spirit of the times. Bowie said on numerous occasions that one of the most significant events of his life was his older half-brother Terry Burns introducing him to Jack Kerouac's beat classic On the Road. David was too young for beat, but by the early 60s the movement had slipped on an Italian suit and mutated into mod, while retaining its aesthetic, a romantic existentialism that combined, in the words of one mod, amphetamine, Jean-Paul Sartre, and John Lee Hooker. Today, when we think of mods, we think of scooters, parkers, and the film Quadrophenia, based on The Who's album of the same name. But this was a much later, cruder iteration. By the time The Who's My Generation reached number 2 on the UK singles chart in November 1965, mod, as its original adherents would have understood it, had already peaked. As David May, a mod from Plymouth who went on to work for Time Out and ITN, put it in Jonathan Green's book Days in the Life, Voices from the English Underground, 1961 to 1971, mods were always intellectual. There was always a large gay element in it. We didn't fight rockers. We were far more interested in some guy's incredible shoes or his leather coat. But underneath this, one did read Camus. The outsider, there it was. It explained an awful lot. A sort of Jean Genet criminal lowlife was also important. Like his friend and sometime rival Mark Bolan, Bowie became a mod in 1964. Unlike Bolan, who was disapproved of by proper mods because of his failure to grasp that there was more to the scene than clothes and drugs, Bowie made the connection between his half-brother's beat tastes, which he shared, and the fact that mod was short for modernist. Lots of the books on Bowie's list are, in this sense, mod books. Not just On the Road and The Outsider, but also T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and the various titles that touch on Dada and Surrealism, both beat fascinations. Alex and his droogs in A Clockwork Orange would have felt familiar to Bowie because he would have known about the antics of Peter Schetzer and his Mod Street gang The Firm, reprobates from the Ilford area who would turn up at parties and smash the place up, but with an art terrorist manifesto that compared their wrecking to the work of René Magritte, Man Ray, and Louis Buñuel. London's art colleges swarmed with intellectual mods. Pete Townsend enrolled at Ealing Technical College and School of Art in the summer of 1961. There he encountered the artist Gustav Metzger's theories of autodestructive art, which a few years later gave Townsend's band The Who a clever-sounding excuse to destroy their instruments on stage. By 1967, David Jones was a veteran of several going-nowhere bands, including The Who-influenced Manish Boys, the King Bees, and the Lower Third. His first solo album having flopped, the next phase for David Bowie, as he renamed himself to avoid confusion with Davy Jones from the Monkees, was hippie, with its interest in happenings and festivals, esoteric religion and the occult, though as ever Bowie did it on his terms, stressing later that he was never a flower child. He explored Tibetan Buddhism, mingling its tenets, such as the concept of the adept, an advanced yogi possessed of arcane knowledge passed down from teacher to pupil, with half-formed ideas scavenged from science fiction novels. For example, Olaf Stapledon's Odd John, source of the phrase homo superior, which turns up in Oh You Pretty Things. Nietzsche, and theosophy about the existence of a gifted elite that has existed throughout history to oversee the fate of the planet and diffuse learning through the lower strata of society. This kind of thinking was fashionable, indeed everywhere in late 60s pop intellectual circles. It's there in Colin Wilson, in hippie favourites Herman Hesse and H.P. Lovecraft, and in the then best-selling novelist John Fowles's 1964 collection of philosophical maxims, The Aristos, which draws on Heraclitus to posit an elect body of supermen who advance society in the face of a lumpen, ignoble mass content merely to exist. It's also there in Louis Bavul's and Jacques Bergier's treasury of conspiracist nonsense, The Morning of the Magicians, translated into English in 1963, and a palpable influence on Quicksand from 1971's Hunky Dory. For Bowie, there may have been a personal dimension to this. The half-brother he adored as a child developed schizophrenia in his 20s and spent much of his life in the hospital. In the Daily Telegraph, the psychologist Oliver James wrote that Bowie often wondered why he was chosen for greatness and Terry for madness. I don't think Bowie necessarily thought of himself at this stage as great or gifted, but he would have been aware that he was quick and bright, more charming, ambitious, and sexually charismatic than most of his peers. Where these qualities would take him was anyone's guess. Bowie's natural egotism ran counter to the prevailing late 60s mood of utopian leftism, notwithstanding his founding of an arts lab in Beckenham to promote, as the blurb put it, the ideals and creative processes of the underground. Another revealing moment in Green's book, Days in the Life, is when Sue Miles, wife of Barry Miles, co-founder of London's trendy Indica bookshop and gallery, where John Lennon and Yoko Ono first met, remembers how obsessed she and her friends were with Alfred Jarry, the playwright and inventor of the mystical science pataphysics, studied by Joan in the Beatles' Maxwell's Silver Hammer, André Breton, and Marcel Duchamp, what she calls that modern avant-garde stuff, and how neatly it merged with what was going on politically at the time, for example, campaigning against nuclear weapons. What's interesting is how Bowie bought into that modern avant-garde stuff not to secure world peace or undermine capitalism, but as a sort of mood board, a dressing-up box he could raid at will. As he put it a few years later in All the Young Dudes, the glam anthem he wrote for Mott the Hoople, he never got it off on revolutionary politics. He just wanted to channel these mostly high modernist influences, artists and writers he admired for their daring and their extravagant sense of spectacle, into a new, knowing type of pop performance. That isn't to say that Bowie wasn't genuinely on a quest, searching like Edward Casaubon in George Eliot's Middlemarch for a key to all mythologies. He found intellectual mentors in people like his early manager, Kenneth Pitt, who remembered Bowie pulling from the shelves at his Marylebone flat 3 significant books: Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, James Baldwin's Nobody Knows My Name, and Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Mime artist Lindsay Kemp kindled his interest in Japanese culture and introduced him to figures such as Jean Cocteau and Jean Genet. In 1966, Bowie befriended the Tibetan guru Kaima Rinpoche, and even toyed with the idea of becoming a Buddhist monk himself. In terms of the list, his interest in Douglas Harding's Buddhist rumination on having no head surely dates from this period. Bowie's Buddhist phase has divided biographers. Was he a true believer, or just posturing? If his Buddhism had its roots, as it probably did in half-brother Terry's passed-on love of Kerouac, then the appeal of Tibetan Buddhism, as opposed to the more beat-friendly Zen variety, was that Tibet was a hot political cause in the mid-60s. But Westerners had been romanticizing the country for years. James Hilton's best-selling novel Lost Horizon, published in 1933, gave the world the idea of the mythical Tibetan utopia of Shangri-La, one with which Bowie seemed smitten when in 1966 he told melody maker, "I want to go to Tibet. It's a fascinating place, you know. I'd like to take a holiday and have a look inside the monasteries. The Tibetan monks, lamas, bury themselves inside mountains for weeks and only eat every 3 days. They're ridiculous, and it's said they live for centuries." A book that isn't on Bowie's list, but probably should be, is the Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harre's memoir of his stint as tutor to the 14th Dalai Lama, 7 years in Tibet, which Bowie named a song for on his 1997 album Earthling, telling a journalist around this time that it had been a very influential book for him when he was about 19 and had left a lasting impression. In the years to come, David Jones would enfold writers like Harre and David Kidd into the Orientalist pioneer side of his David Bowie persona. As the fog of drugs descended during 1974's Diamond Dogs, Philly Dogs tour, this business of persona construction became increasingly fraught. The thin white Duke character from the 1976 album Station to Station compounds all manner of unsavoury types, from the 19th century magus Eliphas Levi, who makes the list, to the openly fascist Norwegian modernist writer Knut Hamsun, who doesn't, though I'm convinced Bowie read him around this time, and the occultist's occultist Aleister Crowley, who doesn't feature either, surprisingly, given how obsessed Bowie was with him. Funnily enough, none of the occult or Nazi-themed books it's often claimed Bowie read while he was cracking up in Los Angeles in the mid-70s is there. There's no sign of The Morning of the Magicians, Israel Regardie's The Golden Dawn, Trevor Ravenscroft's The Spear of Destiny, or Dion Fortune's Psychic Self-Defense. How to explain their absence? One possible explanation is that Bowie simply didn't want to revisit what he later came to regard as an awful, depressing period in his life by including a load of mostly dumb books that reminded him of it, however much they'd meant to him when he was out of his gourd. What else did Bowie like to read? Stephen King, for starters. "I love Stephen King," he told Q in 1999. "He scares the shite out of me." He also liked true crime books, such as Vincent Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry's best-selling Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders, which Tina Brown saw in his hotel room with a half-eaten piece of cheese balanced on the cover when she went to Los Angeles to interview him for the Sunday Times in July 1975. Brown calls the book Manson Murder Trials and doesn't name the author, but she probably meant Helter Skelter, as it won the Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime Book that year. In 1978, Bowie told Crawdaddy magazine about the extraordinary effect Kafka's Metamorphosis had had on him, making him feel as if he was losing his mind. "I had vivid nightmares about that, literal translations of what he was writing about, of enormous bugs flying and lying on their backs, and other creepy, crawly dreams. I saw myself become something unrecognizable, a monster." Then there's the stuff Bowie read for laughs. For example, the book he and his childhood friend Jeff McCormack amused themselves by reciting chunks from on an Amtrak train from Philadelphia to Los Angeles in September 1974, a pornographic novel called Yodel in the Canyon. The main characters in this classic piece of literature were Big Rod Randelli and his girlfriend Mona, recalls McCormack. I won't go into details, but suffice to say, neither Rod nor Mona were shy folk. A genre Bowie seems particularly to have loved is the exotic travelogue, represented on the list by David Kidd and Alberto Denti di Piraino. Artist George Underwood, Bowie's friend since childhood, remembers that in 1989, when he visited Bowie at his house on Mustique, the singer was reading a book about the Victorian explorer and naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace's journey around Indonesia, and almost certainly Wallace's own The Malay Archipelago. Adds Underwood, "It wasn't until a couple of weeks ago, when I went on Amazon to look it up and maybe buy it, that I noticed Wallace had written another book about whether or not there was life on Mars. This would be, Is Mars Habitable? I wish I'd asked David whether he'd read that one as well." Bowie also recommended to Underwood Skullduggery, Mark Shand's account of his and photojournalist Don McCullen's journey through Irian Jaya, now West Papua. David had met Mark Shand and was fascinated with Irian Jaya, says Underwood. He phoned me after this meeting and wanted me to go with him to this uncharted territory. It would have meant going along the Sepik River in a dugout canoe and meeting up with natives who had never seen white men before. David said this would make men of us, and it was something we should do before we died. He was totally serious about this and wanted me to go with him. Of course it never happened, but for a moment I was considering it. A very short moment. Bowie had lots of writer friends and enjoyed literary gossip. His friendship with Hanif Qureshi began when the novelist requested permission to use his songs in the BBC's adaptation of his novel The Buddha of Suburbia. "I thought you'd never ask," Bowie replied, then provided an entire bespoke soundtrack. Bowie seems to have had few serious literary ambitions for himself. In 1987, he told Rolling Stone's Kurt Loder he'd been approached to write an autobiography. 1,000,000 times, for amazing amounts of money. Was he tempted? Not in the least. Perhaps this reluctance to compete on their turf gave his friendships with writers an ease and simplicity missing from his friendships with, say, rival rock stars. William Boyd, a fellow contributor to the magazine Modern Painters in the mid-1990s, says he and Bowie mostly discussed art, which led to their working together on the Nat Tate hoax of 1998, as Boyd remembers. "I did talk to Bowie about books quite a lot, but it was on the gossipy level of, have you read this? Do you know X? What's she like? He always said he'd read all my books, and I used to send him the new ones, and yet I'm absent from his list. Go figure. Maybe he thought our collaboration on Nat Tate was enough, and time has proved him right." Frank O'Hara appears in the book Nat Tate, an American artist 1928 to 1960, of course, as does Hart Crane. My recollection is that we spoke mainly about my contemporaries, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, Ian McEwan, etc. I've checked my journals from the time I used to see him regularly, and all the names banded about are artists. One novelist Bowie actively championed, though, like Boyd, didn't include on the list, is Jake Arnott, author of the atmospheric thriller The Long Firm. The novel is set in a 1950s Soho that would have been familiar to Bowie, both from his half-brother's stories of jazz clubs and espresso bars, and from what he called the family mythology. As a young man, Bowie's father, Haywood Jones, frittered away several £1,000s he'd inherited by opening a piano bar in Charlotte Street called Boop-a-Doop, which failed within a year. Bowie read an awful lot of books, so it's no surprise if people like me and Hanif didn't make the top 100, says Arnott of Bowie's list. I first heard he'd read The Long Firm from film director Stephen Frears. I met Frears at a book launch in 2000, and he said he'd seen Bowie reading it on the Concorde, and Bowie had said to him, "It's very good." I thought at the time that this was just the old film director's trick of blowing smoke up one's arse, but it turned out to be true. Bowie and Arnott finally met backstage at Hammersmith Apollo, and a generous blurb from the Star, "Whenever he's got a new book out, I drop everything," duly appeared on the cover of Arnott's 2003 novel True Crime. Happily, I also once got to meet David Bowie. It was in 2002, shortly before the release of his album Heathen. The magazine I was working for used to sponsor a music festival on London's South Bank called Meltdown. That year, Bowie had agreed to curate it, so I flew to New York to talk to him in a hotel around the corner from his Manhattan apartment. I was terrified. He'd been my hero since I was 12. Now I was 30. I didn't know what to wear, so from some trendy store I bought drainpipe jeans and a T-shirt with cuddly toys on it playing guitar, bass and drums. I hoped this marked me out as a fan of the Strokes, which I recall I was, briefly. It was all a bit desperate. Bowie was kind enough not to appear to notice any of this. I lost the tape years ago in a house move, so no evidence of our encounter survives beyond the printed interview, which mostly focused on his choice of artists for Meltdown. I remember him being friendly and polite, faultlessly so, but also a big character who filled the room. He was restless, jittery, and slightly manic, as if he'd just drunk several strong espressos, which he probably had. More than anything, I remember thinking how funny he was. Properly stand-up comedian funny. I'd put Shirley Bassey in the Meltdown lineup if I thought it would drag in a few punters, he told me. The festival had a reputation for sober worthiness. Shirley Bassey with some Yugoslavian acrobats. Journalists who've interviewed Bowie often remark on the way he weighed you up and gave you the version of himself he thought you wanted, a trick he learned early on from Kenneth Pitt. I suppose I should be flattered that I got Bromley Dave, matey banter interspersed with incongruous intellectual flourishes. Of course, the tripartite view within Christian theology, all delivered in the broadest South London accent. He looked really good for 55. His hair was dyed ash blonde, and there were dabs of concealer on the bags under his eyes. But his body was as trim and wiry as ever. He'd finally given up smoking after numerous failed attempts. I was almost surprised when 2 years later he had his heart attack. This momentous, terrifying event precipitated the great hiatus in Bowie's career, a decade-long stretch during which, give or take the odd guest appearance, he concentrated his energy on being a husband and a father. He also used the time to do what his long-standing producer Tony Visconti described to the Times as a phenomenal amount of reading: Old English history, Russian history, the monarchs of Great Britain, what made them bad and good. The books on the list published during this period, so he very likely read them then, are Junot Díaz's The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Tom Stoppard's The Coast of Utopia, Susan Jacoby's The Age of American Unreason, and John Savage's Teenage. Of these, only the Stoppard fits any of Visconti's categories, but it's likely Bowie used his hiatus to read deeply around particular subjects, for example Russian history. This is probably when he tackled Orlando Fidges's ginormous A People's Tragedy. You need time on your hands for that one. Aging changes your relationship to history. As the bittersweet milestone of his 70th birthday approached, perhaps it dawned on Bowie that A, a century isn't very long, and B, far from being the main character in the film of his life, which illusion most of us have when we're young, regardless of how we make our living, he was really an infinitesimal part of a much bigger, older story, a revenge tragedy where everyone dies and keeps on dying, day after day, until the last syllable of recorded time. One of his final songs, Black Star, squares up to this cosmic irony with the savage glee of a man who has nothing left to lose. The devilish trickster who takes over the narration halfway through, telling us he was born upside down and the wrong way round, is...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?